Welcome back. So let's move on to talking about configuration and also environment variables in Laravel 5. Now, in a previous lesson, we already talked just a little bit about this. We have a .env file within our project root with a number of keys and values. So how exactly does Laravel reference these? Well, we do that within specific configuration files. Notice we have this config directory. Let's take a look. Most projects will need some kind of database connection, right? So let's take a look at our database configuration file. And notice it just returns a simple PHP array. And you can learn a lot by reading through these. Notice that Taylor Otwell, the creator of Laravel, does a really excellent job of providing perfectly formatted and perfectly readable comments for each of these items. And as an aside, if you want your brain to explode just a little bit, notice that throughout the entire framework, his style of commenting has each line with 3 characters less than the line that preceded it. You'll find that throughout the entire framework. And that's just a small, trivial example of the level of detail and care that goes into this framework, which is why I use it. Anyways, let's scroll down, and you'll see that we have various connections. And that's because for any application, your database needs may be completely different. For example, for a small project, maybe you're building a simple to-do list or something. Well, in those cases, maybe a file-based SQLite database is all you need. Well, you don't need to do anything else. The API for you will be identical. So you just update your configuration file and you're good to go. Or for the next project, you want to use MySQL or Postgres or SQL Server. Laravel comes with these drivers out of the box. Now, if I scroll up, notice here, imagine that we're using MySQL. Well, you need to specify the host and the database and the username and the password, right? But we don't hard code those in. Really, it's sort of a bad practice to hard code this stuff in. You don't want to do that. It then becomes part of your version control. You then have issues where if you share this locally, that can be weird. When you push it up to GitHub, you don't want the public to see these passwords. So it all just gets kind of crazy if you go that route. But instead, if you reference an environment variable, this is much better. We can check this into version control without any worry. Now, if you're thinking, well, Jeff, you still have it in this file, so people will still see these secret codes and passwords. But no, that's actually not the case. And that's because our environment files are always ignored by Git. Let me show you. Within our git ignore file, that is listed here, which basically means when you're tracking things, just ignore that file. You don't need to include it. That way, for local development, you can have this set up. When you push this up to production, you can manually create an environment file on that end. And by taking that approach, we actually get a lot of flexibility. So anyways, back in our database file, we can see that the host, well, we're going to look for an environment variable called dbHost. But if you couldn't find one, we will use a default of localhost. And the same is true for the name of the database, the username, and the password. Now, if we take a look, here they are. So when you install Laravel, you can either use these defaults if you installed Homestead, like we did in lesson 2. But if you didn't, and your settings are a little bit different, this is the only file that you need to update. So let's imagine that for our first project, we just need an SQLite database. All right. We go to Database, and we scroll to the top, and we choose our default connection. That will be SQLite. And again, just to remind you, all of the connections you can choose are listed here. And if by any chance you want to use something else, well, it can be extended to include your own driver. So now that we've set a new default, here is our connection array for SQLite. And notice that it's referencing a database.sqlite file within our storage directory, which is right here. So let's go ahead and create that file. And we can simply use touch. It'll be a simple file database. Storage, database.sqlite. Okay, that's it. We're now using SQLite. So now that you understand environment variables and configuration a little bit better, and don't forget, you have all of these different configuration files for your entire application. So do we want debug mode? What is the app URL? What is the time zone you want us to use? All of these sorts of things can be adjusted within the config folder. So as homework, Go through every one of these files. You don't have to memorize it, but just let some of this stuff sink in so you can get a basic idea as to what is configurable.